You are listening to the Tank Magazine podcast. In this episode, Ismail Einashe talks to the journalist and editor of new Humanist magazine, Daniel Trilling. Trilling writes on migration, borders, and nationalism in Europe, and his reporting has appeared in The Guardian, The New York Times, The New Statesman, and the London Review of Books. His new book, Light in the Distance, Exile and Refuge at the Borders of Europe, published by Picador, draws on years of reporting at the heart of the refugee crisis and illuminates the experiences of those crossing Europe's borders in search of asylum. The text version of this interview can be found in the 2018 Tank Summer Reader issue.
So, welcome. Thanks for speaking to Tank Magazine. We're here with Daniel talking about his new book, which is fabulous because I've read it, Lights in the Distance. And it's about borders and refugees. And I thought the first thing is, I just want you to talk a little bit about what initially got you interested in telling these stories, because you're now obviously very well known for this reporting on refugees. But what was the initial, incident or thought that led you to basically spend 5 years working on this book and sort of reporting on refugee crisis on Europe's borders?
Well, I suppose on one level, the subject of refugees and displacement, I've always been interested in, partly because some of my own family members were refugees and I grew up hearing stories about that when I was a child. But more immediately, it was because I had previously been working on a project about the far right. And I'd gone to Greece in 2012 to do a story about how the financial crisis was having an impact on Greek society, thinking that I was going to write this piece about how it was leading to the rise in far-right extremism. And I'd gone to do some reporting on Golden Dawn, the far-right party in Greece. And as part of that, I thought, well, I'd like to look at some of the people who are being targeted by their violence. And I went and interviewed this Afghan family who were living in a neighbourhood of Athens where lots of migrants had either settled or were passing through. And I was quite shocked by what I was found. So this was a family that had come to Europe in search of asylum. And not only were they being targeted by violent racists, but the whole system that should exist to protect people in that kind of situation had broken down. So they were unable to access any help from the state. They were not only being targeted by neo-Nazi gangs, but they felt that the police were behaving in a very hostile way to them, that they were at risk of being left homeless, left destitute. And this gave me a lot of questions about, well, why is that happening in Europe? Why also, at the time, I felt I was starting to hear about this more and more anyway, and that made me wonder, well, is this a thing that's getting worse? What's going on here? There seems to be a process by which Europe is building more and more fences and other kinds of defences and methods of deterrence to keep out migrants. So all of that was in my head, questions that I wanted to answer. And I thought, well, I'll try and follow this story by going out and reporting from different parts of Europe on people who seem to be having difficult journeys into Europe, around Europe, people who seem to be getting stuck and left on the streets or put into camps and detention centres in different places. I started doing that and kept following it.
Right. And you know what I think is really interesting is, okay, so you had years ago Al Jazeera making this whole ridiculous statement saying, we're going to describe everybody who comes to Europe, by land, sea, as refugee. And then there are people who are on the right wing who want to frame everybody as an economic migrant. But as you know, for example, if you're coming from Africa, if you're a young Gambian guy or a young Eritrean guy or Somalia, wherever you come from in sub-Saharan Africa, even if you might have in the classical sense began as a migrant, say, the journey that you might have via Niger, via the slave camps, via everything that you might see before you reach Europe, changes that. So I just want to talk a little bit about these kind of definitions and what they mean in the context of talking about refugees and migrants and all this sort of stuff in Europe.
Yeah. Actually, I deliberately didn't put the word refugee in the title or subtitle of the book. Those two words, exile and refuge, were quite deliberately chosen because I think when it comes to talking about refugees and asylum, our way of thinking about it gets very easily shaped and then constrained by the legal frameworks that exist around those particular categories. And they exist for good reason. I mean, to take it back to its roots, the reason why we have an international system of protection for refugees is because it's an attempt to fix a problem in a way that the world is organised, where individuals have rights but those rights are usually only guaranteed by your membership of a nation state. So you have to be a citizen of a country in order to be able to access a lot of quite fundamental rights. When somebody is made a refugee, that is to say when they're forced from their homes by war or persecution, they quite often lose those rights because they are forced to move to another country that hasn't invited them and isn't offering them any kind of citizenship, even a kind of temporary citizenship. So that's really why you have got this international system to set up processes by which people who are forcibly displaced can access their rights in other countries, can access forms of protection. If they need to stay there long term, they can actually, start pathways towards becoming citizens of their new homes. Now, hopefully that's clear that all exists for a good reason. And the reason why it was set up after the Second World War is because the lack of such a system of protection in the first half of the 20th century had led to great disasters. It was, displaced Jews all around Europe were one of the things that fed into anti-Semitism, the rise of, really extreme genocidal kind of nationalism in Europe. So this whole framework is an attempt to fix that and to protect the rights of the individual even when they lose their membership of a particular state. The problem is it's only provisional and it's a fix for a problem that isn't completely sufficient. And one of the problems that arises, it means that people who come into contact with that system, people who are trying to claim asylum somewhere, are subject to this very intense process of being assessed at every stage of what they do, because in order to give protection to certain people who fit into the category of refugee as defined by international and national laws, that implies that you're excluding other people. So there are some people who qualify as refugees and some people who don't. And then that raises a question, well, what do you do with the people who don't? If you're saying that, well, refugees, states can't send genuine refugees back to their home countries because they're, in great danger if they're sent back, then it implies, well, then states have got a right to deport or do other things to people who don't meet those categories. And that leads to a problem on two levels. One is that there's this huge border infrastructure, dysfunctional and quite violent asylum systems as well that are there to kind of filter out the so-called genuine refugees from the others. And then there's a way in which it shapes our thinking, in that I find it's very easy to slip into thinking that way about migrants just as an individual or somebody who is not, I don't work for a government. I'm not engaged in deciding who's got certain legal rights and who doesn't. I'm a journalist. But even in that role, you can find yourself very pressured into thinking, well, okay, I've arrived in Calais, for example. There are people destitute on the streets. Well, which ones are the genuine refugees, and should I go and interview them? And these other people who are here for more complex reasons, well, that's difficult, so let's just kind of ignore them and focus on one part of this. And I think that way of thinking needs to really be broken down because, as you mentioned, a person may well not leave their home country because they were being persecuted, because there were a war there. At that point, they may well be what's called an economic migrant, somebody travelling somewhere in search of work. But if, say, for example, you leave a country in West Africa for those reasons and end up in Libya being tortured and abused by traffickers, being forced onto an inflatable boat that is then sent out into the Mediterranean, those experiences are the same, regardless of your reason for having left your country in the first place. And what I think is really important is to see the experiences for what they are, regardless of who that person is and where they fit into that wider system, and to think of it in terms of needs rather than just rights, or who has obeyed the rules and who has not obeyed the rules.
Let's just start with another question, actually based on what you were just saying, which is focusing on the experiences of the people that you've interviewed. And I think what's really wonderful about the book is that it illuminates the stories that, we see these statistics, we see them as unwanted. We occasionally hear about the number of dead that have crossed on dinghies to Europe. And I think what's really wonderful about the book is there's texture, there's layer to it. So can you just tell us about some of the people in the book, for example, Jamal and Caesar, Fatima, and how you met them, but also why you chose those kinds of stories to illuminate in your book?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, my project had begun as one to go and visit various different border areas of Europe to see what the effects of that increasing militarization were having on people that were trying to cross into Europe. And initially I just tried to get to as many places as possible. I thought at first it would just be things that were literally on the geographical edges of the European Union, but I quite soon came to realise that, first of all, that process of border control, trying to filter people, trying to separate the deserving from the undeserving was actually happening everywhere, because that's a feature of borders in the 21st century. They're not just fences at the edges of territories, but they're systems often quite highly developed, quite highly technological for filtering people, even when they're right in the middle of cities, deciding what rights people have and don't have, when they're included and when they're excluded. And one of the results of this initial travelling and reporting was that I would interview people about their journeys to Europe, the experiences they were having in the places I met them, but then we would stay in touch. And at first, actually, that was a bit of a surprise. I think I just thought about it in a very conventional journalistic sort of way, that I would interview somebody and say, yes, thank you very much for the interview, then the piece would be done and I would move on to something else. But because we would swap the contact details, either email addresses or add each other on Facebook, what would happen was I'd just keep chatting to people, and I would sort of learn more about their lives just from having conversations with them casually, or I would notice that people would be moving from one place to another, and that would make me very curious about, well, how did you get from perhaps southern Bulgaria to Germany, or why I met you in Calais and now you're emailing me from some other country in northern Europe.
You're in Costa Coffee in Finsbury Park.
Well, exactly, yeah. So I thought it would be good just to follow people and keep in touch with them. So one person, for example, is a young man called Jamal, who I originally met in Calais. He was in his early 20s when I met him in 2014. He's originally from Sudan, but by the time I had met him, he'd actually already been in Europe for 5 years. He'd paid smugglers to take him to Greece, and then had got stuck in Greece, living in a squatted building near the port of Patras, which was a place where people without the right to travel would wait and hide out and try and sneak underneath lorries that were going into the port and onto the ferries. And, he'd arrived around the time he turned 18, so he'd spent the first years of his adult life living, on no money, learning how to look through bins for food, how to form little networks with other groups of migrants, or perhaps Greek anarchists as well, about how to survive in those conditions, how to squat buildings, learning how to chase after lorries and the places to hide underneath them, and then eventually made his way over to Calais. And we stayed in touch for several years, and he told me a great detail about the mechanics of how you make these kind of journeys, but also the sort of way in which his ideas about the world had been formed, which I found just as interesting. So, he told me he hadn't ever really intended to leave Sudan, but he'd got into trouble with the police, and, Sudan has got a very repressive police state, and really through no fault of his own, he'd fallen under suspicion of being linked to a rebel group and then was put under surveillance. It had made his daily life impossible, so he just felt he had to get out. But at the same time, throughout his whole adolescence, as he was telling me, he was obsessed with American movies that came in through the Saudi satellite TV channel that was being beamed into their homes. So, already he had this kind of, kind of global imagination.
Kind of image of what Europe and the West is.
He was, even though it's a case where we in the West can tend to be quite ignorant of people living in those kind of places.
We imagine they don't get, Rihanna. And there's a bit in the book I remember reading it. Was it with Jamal where he's
a big Rihanna fan.
He's
for
a big
example.
Rihanna fan.
But it's more just like we don't see them, but they see us.
Yeah, totally.
It's the way I think of it. That to most people in Western Europe, there won't be a very developed image of what Sudan is or what Khartoum the city of Khartoum is like. But Jamal, for example, sitting there as a 14, 15-year-old kid, fighting his sister for the remote control, had a very strong idea of what, maybe London was like, cities in America were like. I mean, I would say that that's an idealised image that is given by global media culture, so it's not that the image is necessarily fully accurate, but that this was already part of his world. He could imagine himself in Europe before he'd even left. And it was what I found from talking to him in detail about his journey was that was an incredibly strong motivating factor in keeping himself going as well. So, he got to Greece in the middle of an economic crisis, very little resources to support people in his situation, didn't feel like Europe. So he had to keep on going, because he knew there would be somewhere better at the end of it. What came up again and again in the stories of the people that I encountered was just the need to have some kind of idea about why they had been through these particularly harsh experiences and what they were pushing themselves onwards to achieve. And it wouldn't always be to do with it wouldn't necessarily be, oh, well, because I've heard about Europe and America and can imagine myself there. It may, I can think of another person, for example, a woman called Fatima, who's originally comes from Lagos in Nigeria. She had been a migrant worker in Libya as the country descended into civil war and had eventually been forced out onto the boat towards Italy. So she'd never intended to go to Europe. Europe was not part of her aspirations. She just reached a point where she had to flee Tripoli to save her life. But she told me that she remembered as she was about to board this flimsy inflatable boat that the smugglers were forcing her onto on the Libyan coast, she said she made a bargain with God. If God would spare her life, she would devote the rest of her life to raising the alarm about what happens to women who take those journeys. And so for the whole time that she's been in Europe, which is 3 years now, I think, 2 or 3 years, she's had this very strong sense that her mission is to be a women's rights activist, to raise the alarm about Nigerian women being trafficked into the sex trade, to advocate for the rights of women, girls, or other migrants, even men, the ones that kind of get forgotten in the system. She had a very strong sense, for example, that people from West Africa were receiving worse treatment within the Italian system, and she felt it was, took it upon herself to really make a noise and make a fuss about that. So again, a very different story from Jamal's, but again, a really strong sense of purpose, like a way to keep going. And I think when people don't have that strong sense and that story they can tell themselves, that's when they become really unstuck.
I mean, I think this is... Well, I'm biased because I'm your friend, but also because I think I'm an admirer of your work, and also I've read the book, and I think it's really, it's wonderful, it's moving, it's got texture, it's really illuminating, and I think it's illuminating particularly because of these stories. Now, I have to ask about the backlash, or not the backlash, but look, so you've done this sensitively as a reporter, you've tirelessly worked for the last many years, and I think I've achieved a really great bit of work here with this book. But a lot of people will say, look, these people came here by choice. Whether they're refugees or migrants, it doesn't matter, they came here. And what you've seen is a toxic kind of xenophobia that's been increasing massively. And actually, you know this, because we've been in these sort of places, not together, but we reported from it. And often I know that the most difficult part of someone's journey is often when they arrive. They're stuck in limbo, they don't have paperwork, there might be a really difficult time. And then the political backdrop, which seems to be worsening. And even though the book that you've done is so sensitively reported, people might still characterise this as some sort of sympathetic ode to the refugee migrant experience. I mean, what's your sort of response to that?
Okay, so what I would say is that the refugee crisis in Europe is the result of pre-existing attempts to control migration. This is not the result of borders being thrown open at all. It's the result of, as I was saying, now nearly 2 decades of increasingly severe and complex controls on the movement of people from outside Europe. And the result has not been that states have been able to minutely control the movement of people down to the last person, because that effectively is not possible. As I was saying, you will always have people who don't fit into the system somehow, people who find a way through. And it would be much better if we recognise that happens, and to change our way of thinking about this. It would be much better if we recognise that is going to happen, and to construct systems and ways of interacting with people that accept that people always have moved throughout human history, that it is much better to find solutions to problems that don't force large numbers of people out of their homes, whether those be wars or extreme poverty or climate change, but that even if every one of those kind of problems was solved, people would continue to move, because that is what humans do. And people are attached to places, but they also move and they develop attachments to new places and new people. So one of the reasons why the manner of arrival of refugees and migrants in the last few years has been so chaotic was because they were being forced into these bottlenecks by our pre-existing border systems. One of the reasons why they then have gone on to have often such difficulties making new lives for themselves in the countries where they've arrived is because of our systems of filtering them out and deciding who's deserving and undeserving. Because deciding whether somebody is a genuine refugee or not is not a quick process. Even in the best funded systems in Europe, it is not a quick process. And in countries that can't really handle it, it's a state of limbo that goes on for many years, which is why I think it's so important to try and approach the world as it is. To recognise, well, regardless of what a piece of paper says about somebody, if they're in your country, if they're in your city, if they're in your neighbourhood, they are there. You both exist in the same space, and you both have got interests in common, and you both got the capacity to work together to solve problems that are of concern to both of you. So to me, that's the only way through this. If you retreat into this kind of corner that says, well, these people shouldn't be here, we need to keep them out, we need clear lines dividing one group of people from another, you won't achieve that. What you will do is ensure the ongoing chaos and violence that we are seeing at borders around the world today. One thing that I would like people to take away from this book is to realise that this is an ongoing process. This isn't just a refugee crisis that happened in 2015 and 16 and dropped out of the headlines, that there is a constant process of people trying to get where they feel they need to go for a variety of reasons, and states trying to halt them or deter them, and the result being constantly people getting caught and trapped and chewed up in this machinery of border control. And that's with us. And you can support it or oppose it, make your own mind up, but just recognise that it's there and it exists and it's ongoing.
To hear more podcasts from Tank Magazine, be sure to subscribe on iTunes or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is taken from Waiting Games by Kate Simcoe and the London Electronic Orchestra.